Hey, everybody. Welcome to the History Things podcast. I am your host, Pat McGuire. Joining me today is my co-host, as always, Matt Borders. And once again with us, we have our very, very good friend, Kevin Pawlak, back to talk about the Maryland campaign of 1862 once again, do a little follow-up, take some of your listener questions, clarify some things, maybe extrapolate a little bit on a thought or two here and there, but kind of to sort of wrap up the awesome initial offering we did for our show. Kevin was our first guest, so we are going to revisit that and sort of close the chapter for now on the Maryland campaign of 1862. These are crazy times we're living in. That's why we're doing this via Skype instead of everybody here in the War Department studios with me in Frederick, Maryland. We're all kind of spread out. So, Matt, good to see you. Kevin, thanks for joining us, buddy. Matt, we'll start with you since, my co-host here on the show, man. How's it been? It's been a weird couple weeks.
It has been a weird couple of weeks, Pat, and I appreciate you helping me get this set up with the Skype conversation. I am not the best with technology, so all of that support is appreciated. For me, my time's been spent doing a lot of reading, research, and writing. So there's always more writing to do, always more research to do. So I've been trying to use my time wisely. I know you've got the family as well there. How's things been with you?
Things have been good. We were part of the quarantine here. My day job had potentially exposed me to the COVID-19 virus, so I did have to go through a quarantine and a testing, and thankfully my results were negative. And I got sick, but I wasn't too terribly sick. So whatever it was came and went. And we've just been doing like everybody else. We've been doing our best to stay home and practice social distancing and things like that. And so far, so good. I'm in good health. Wife's in good health. Our kiddo's in good health. And, as somebody who's always wanted to have just a chunk of time to write, like in a weird way, this time of quarantine has been a blessing because I've had a ton of time to sit and write, which I know you have as well. So trying to make lemonade out of lemons here, with the weirdness. So Kevin, how's things going for you, man? Quarantine been a bit weird in the Pawlak household?
It has. I've been working still, so that's been both good and bad. I've been working mostly inside in the house, though. I haven't gotten out too much, but it's been different, that's for sure. It's been very odd. When the scare first really started, I had a severe allergy attack, just seasonal allergies and whatnot. So I was thinking, oh gosh, do I have this thing too? But thankfully, it's all past now. So.
Yes, thankfully indeed. Have you gotten anything official, Kevin, from the state? I know there was some confusion there in Virginia as to what exactly its employees were supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I guess all government employees, whether it's state government or local government, are considered essential. So I'm still going to work, I guess. But all of of course, with the governor's latest proclamation, executive order, if you will, about basically having everybody stay inside, a stay-at-home order until June 10th. I mean, all of our spring events have been shut down.
That's
and
wild.
none of our historic sites are going to open on time or anything like that. So, who knows where we're going to be in a few months. And hopefully, I am hopeful that maybe things will get better and we won't have to last until June 10th. But, things could go beyond that, too. So we'll just have to wait and see. Take it one day at a time.
That's all we can do at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Kevin, buddy, can we get you to tilt your camera down a little bit so I can actually see your face?
Tell you what, I got to sit up. Here we go. How's that?
Yeah.
Now my feet really can't touch the ground. How's that? That better? All
right. Thanks for being a good sport about that.
No problem.
Very cool then. Well, I'm glad that you're staying safe, man. At some point, we'll look back on this and have a unique set of skills as historians and sort of chroniclers of the time, and we'll write about it. And when we all live to be old-haired gray men, this will be just another massive moment in time that we can look back on and draw context from, hopefully. So I'm glad you guys are staying safe.
Most definitely.
So
shall we jump into it?
Yeah, let's get into it. Let's get right into the business at hand here. So we've had some really awesome support, some great feedback on episode 1, which again, thank you so much for stopping by and hanging out with us, Kevin. really shedding some awesome insights into, the Maryland campaign, the setup, and obviously where we went leading into episode 2, which is out right now. So let's get into some of the listener questions that we had sent to us. Again, for anybody listening, you can even ask us questions still in relation to this episode or any other future episodes. You can reach out to us at historythingspodcast@gmail.com, which we'll put on the bottom of the screen here. So, anytime you hear something, you have a quick question, just shoot it to us, and we'll do our absolute best to address it. So we'll lead off with Sarah in Baltimore. She sent me a question that I've actually pondered a good bit myself. And I will turn it over to you, Kevin, as an Antietam expert, a certified guide here. Sarah asks, why not have the Army of Northern Virginia cross directly at Harper's Ferry? Her logic is that if Lee is aware of the garrison on the Virginia side of the river, why waste time getting to Frederick and doubling back when you could just address the garrison head on and cross the river all in one spot?
It's a great question.
That's a very good question. I think part of it is, I think it's a twofold reason, really. The first reason I would say most direct is that Lee doesn't think that the Harper's Ferry garrison is ever going to put up much of a fight. I think basically that Lee believes as soon as he crosses into Maryland, interdicts himself between the Harper's Ferry garrison and Washington and Baltimore, cuts off communications, that garrison is just going to flee either north into Pennsylvania or west, and it's going to be off the table, so to speak, for the campaign. And so I don't think Lee ever really views it as a serious threat and doesn't feel like, at least initially when he's debating where to cross into Maryland, that he needs to waste time with it. So to speak.
He gets to Frederick and is like, what is this garrison still doing here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he's very much surprised by it. I think if you look at some evidence of that, as I view it at least, is the tight timetable that Lee sets for this. Special Orders number 191 is issued on September 9th. It goes into effect the next morning, September 10th. But Lee very clearly spells out in those orders that he expects his army to be in a position to reunite somewhere in the Boonesboro, Sharpsburg, Hagerstown area within 3 days. So Lee is not expecting, in my opinion, because of that, the Harper's Ferry garrison at all to be a problem. He basically thinks either A, he's just going to be able to steamroll through it, or B, it's going to flee as soon as those men hear that Stonewall Jackson is heading their way.
Right. Cool. Yeah, I've always just thought, why not just take your overwhelming army and cross the river right there, knowing what we know about how Jackson does surround the city pretty, handily on the campaign itself. Why not just do that with greater numbers and, have your whole army undivided and things like that. So I thought that was a really cool question and one that I'd thought about. So we picked that one to get out to you. So
yeah, and it's good because I really think, Harper's Ferry is it is what, in my opinion, forces the collapse of Lee's campaign into Maryland. If it's not for Harper's Ferry, Lee's probably not going to divide his army. If he doesn't divide his army, his timetable doesn't go behind schedule. And if that doesn't happen, then he's not caught with a divided army with the Union army so close to him. And that's really his undoing.
Awesome.
Now, a bit of a different angle with this one, Kevin. When we were discussing really the building of the Army of the Potomac in particular, there was a question that we got about volunteers versus the regulars. Could you expound on that a little bit as to the difference between these two forces and how they fit within the structure of the Army?
Yeah, absolutely. So the basically, just to really boil it down, the term regular means that these soldiers are part of the United States Army, the professional United States Army. Now, by September of 1862, most of the regulars, which is comprised in just one division, about 1,000 men, at least regular infantry, most of those guys are veterans of Second Manassas. There are maybe a few new enlistees that have been thrown into that, but think of them as the professional army, just like our United States Army today.
Before the war.
In many cases, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, this is like the old army, if you will. The volunteers are the guys that serve under the flag of both the United States, of course, because they will be mustered into the United States. But when they first sign up as volunteers, they sign up for the state. Most typically, but there are some rare exceptions to that, the state in which they reside. And then those states will offer the services of these regiments to the United States government. And so the United States will muster them into the Army, but as volunteers instead. So, I mean, it can really get complicated when you're looking at not the private soldiers so much, but generals, and you have generals that are, let's say a brigadier general in the United States Volunteers, and then you have generals in the United States Army, the professional army. So I guess it's not a perfect example, but a good way to think of it today is sort of the regulars are the United States Army today, and the volunteers are almost like the National Guard, if you will. Again, not a perfect example, but something that the closest parallel that we probably have today.
Yeah, I can see that.
All right. So Mike in Oxford asks us, for being a major Civil War battle, why does the town of Sharpsburg remain so quaint and quiet, unlike another major Civil War battle 9 months later to the north in Gettysburg, which has become so commercialized?
That's a great question. I would say the real easy answer, and then I'll try to take the hard answer, is simply I'm forgetting exactly the year, and both of you might be able to remember it better than I do. But when Washington County was voting for its what city or town was going to be its county seat, Sharpsburg lost to Hagerstown by, I believe, 1 vote. Again, I'm forgetting the year on that. But if you've seen anything of what Hagerstown looks like today as compared to Sharpsburg, I think that's one reason that Sharpsburg is not the county seat. It doesn't have to have all those county government facilities, and so it's been allowed to remain quite quaint and small. The other thing is, I think that while preservation efforts certainly started early at both Gettysburg and Antietam, preservation efforts started almost immediately after the Battle of Gettysburg, at Gettysburg, the Gettysburg battlefield. And, of course, that brings in tourism and things like that. But I think Gettysburg is also, it was and is today, a much larger town. At the time of the Civil War, it's about 2,400 people living in Gettysburg, 10 roads leading into the town. Sharpsburg is a crossroads town, but it's significantly smaller, less than half the population of Gettysburg. And I think that the fact that Gettysburg is a larger population center also helped attract people more to Gettysburg and attract veterans more to Gettysburg than it does a place like Antietam.
I mean, Sharpsburg, the contrast is, it's stark, glaring, the number of adjectives you throw at it, because, you go down Steinway Avenue, and it's like walking through Disneyland sometimes. There are, on a nice summer day, there are hundreds of people out. So you walk down Main Street, and the same exact day in Sharpsburg, and maybe you wave hey to 10 people. Everybody's going to Nutter's Ice Cream. That's like the one thing everybody's doing in town. Otherwise, their Main Street's relatively quiet. So I thought that was a great question too, to sort of, I guess, illustrate the difference in how each individual town sort of, deals with the preservation of its own history.
Now, this one's less of a question, Kevin, and more of kind of one of these major themes that we oftentimes see, you and I in particular see being guides at Antietam. How about you tackle was Antietam a tactical draw idea?
One of my favorite questions to get. I would say it's probably the hardest question that we usually get, but based off what we just talked about, I'd say the hardest question we get as guides is where's a good place to eat in Sharpsburg, because there's just not many options. But Antietam as a tactical draw, I think you have to look at the terrain of the battlefield. And in the years that I've studied Antietam, this sounds dumb, but also a slap you in the forehead kind of moment. The most overlooked piece of terrain on that entire battlefield is what the battle is named for, Antietam. It's the Antietam Creek. And when you look at Robert E. Lee, he is the aggressor in this campaign. He is the one that decides to keep the war going at that pace. He easily could have, after the victory at Second Manassas, just pulled back into northern and central Virginia and let both armies rest and refit for a while, but Lee is keeping his foot on the throat of the United States government. And so it's very much a campaign that's offensive in nature, if you will, for Robert E. Lee. And yet, despite that, throughout the entire campaign, Lee fights very well defensively and in a defensive mindset. And what I mean by that is, if you look at where Lee positions his army throughout the campaign, he always places a natural barrier of some sort between his army and where he believes the enemy is going to come from. So the first of those barriers is the Potomac River. When he begins crossing on September 4th, most of the Union Army is still south of the Potomac River in Virginia. When Lee coalesces with his army, we generally speak of it as Frederick, but really he's more in the area of Monocacy Junction, and what Lee is using as his natural barrier there is the Monocacy River. When Lee divides his army with Special Orders number 191 to subdue Harper's Ferry, Lee's natural barriers go from rivers to mountains. Now it's the Catoctin Mountain Range and South Mountain Range. And of course, both of those mountain ranges are cracked on September 14th. And so when Lee falls back to Sharpsburg, he realizes that he has another natural barrier in his front, and that is Antietam Creek. And when Lee first arrays his army, September 15th, September 16th, he's really in control of 4 of the 5 major crossings in the battlefield proper. And that would be the Upper Bridge, which is kind of really a no man's land. Lee's not defending it right up to the bridge itself, but he's watching it. Prize 4 south of that. The Middle Bridge is pretty much in Union control at that point, but then Lee is also defending the Burnside Bridge and Snavely's Ford. So Lee's barrier is still there on the morning of September 17th. Come the evening of September 17th, when the battle comes to an end, and this is a long-winded answer of getting into this tactical draw question. Lee's barrier is cracked. All 5 of the major crossing points on the battlefield proper of Antietam are in Union hands. And so Lee no longer has that natural barrier between himself and the enemy. And while I'm not going to sit here and say that it's a major tactical Union victory, I think for that reason, Lee no longer has that shield between himself and McClellan. And Lee is going to look to try and drive the Union right flank back across the Antietam to reestablish that barrier on September 18th. But once Lee realizes that that's not possible, he will look behind him for another barrier, the Potomac River, get his army on the other side of that, put that river between himself and McClellan, and Lee's going to begin to maneuver again. So I think because of the Federals really negating the effect of the creek itself, that I think you could call it a minor, again, very minor. It's not a major tactical victory for the Federals, but I think at least a minor tactical victory.
Cool. Before I get into my next question, I actually have an on-the-spot follow-up to that question. This pattern of Lee using natural barriers and things like that, is that something we've identified with the 150 plus years of study, or is that something that you think Lee's opponents were able to identify a pattern in his fighting style in real time? Because if that's something that he's doing regularly, it would almost, and it's something that could have been identified, I'm always wondering, like, how did the Union not prepare for Lee to do these things and, like, kind of act accordingly, knowing where all these rivers and mountain ranges are?
I think they probably might have picked up on Lee's trend, if you will. The issue is that there are so many barriers for Lee to use in the Eastern Theater of the war. But I think also it was just a natural, Lee's an engineer, and so many of these generals were familiar, at least, with terrain and the importance of it. And so I think Lee was just a student of his time in recognizing the importance of having these defensive barriers just in case he needed them.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well, my next question, which I thought was a softball question when I read it, and then I thought for a minute, I thought, once I read it, I was like, it's actually kind of profound because, there could be a lot of opinion and so I'll get on with it and, you do your best to answer it. Jim in Falls Church asks, what do you think the most important moment of the battle is? Place or event? Like, what is the moment?
When
Yeah,
you said
that
opinions and we were talking Antietam, I thought immediately it was going to be a George McClellan question. This one
I
I
did
can
not
take.
pick any
that's
George
coming up.
McClellan.
Oh, great. Okay. All right. I'll be ready for
I
that
did
one.
not pick them on purpose. I knew Matt was going to pick one, so I did not pick any McClellan question.
All right. I'll take this one. I think to me the most significant event, and when thinking of an event, I think of anything from a single regimental action, something perhaps as small as the 51st New York and 51st Pennsylvania taking the Burnside Bridge to a much larger action, such as perhaps McClellan deciding to send the Second Corps across Antietam Creek. And I'm going to kind of stick with that vein of the Second Corps, because I think what's the most important event to me of the entire battle is the wrecking, if you will, of John Sedgwick's Federal Division in the West Woods about mid-morning on September 17th. And it's just a very quick action, maybe 15, 20, 30 minutes at most. But Sedgwick's division is going to be the Union division that loses proportionally the highest number of casualties on the Antietam battlefield. It's nearly 40% casualties that they will lose. But the fallout from this is, I think, what makes it the most important event. Up to this point, the Federal High Command, George McClellan specifically, believed, I think with some optimism, that things were going pretty well on the northern end of the battlefield. About 7:20 in the morning, McClellan sends Sumner and the Second Corps, two divisions of the Second Corps, across Antietam Creek to follow up with some of Joe Hooker's earlier morning success. And that's when Sedgwick and Sumner find trouble in the West Woods. But the fallout from that is that Edwin Sumner is the ranking federal officer on the northern end of the battlefield. And he is right there in the midst of the West Woods action, seeing all this firsthand. And I think he is, to steal a quote from Abraham Lincoln of when he describes William Rosecrans following the Battle of Chickamauga, that Sumner is almost like a duck hit on the head, as Lincoln said of Rosecrans. In the sense that, a really apt quote, I think, for describing Sumner at this point in the battle, because Sumner has seen the fallout of or the potential of what a Confederate offensive on the northern end of the battlefield could do to an attacking Union force. And so Sumner will begin to piece together a very solid artillery line that runs about a mile in length, consists of at least 40 guns that become very substantial and really prevent Lee from retaking the initiative on that end of the battlefield. But up until Sedgwick's repulse in the West Woods, the Federals retained the initiative on the northern end of the battlefield and really on the whole battlefield and the whole campaign. But the Confederate attack in the West Woods and the driving of Sedgwick out of those woods forces the initiative into really no man's land. I know it wasn't a term in the 19th century, but the initiative is there for the taking after Sedgwick's division is driven out of the West Woods, but nobody really takes it ever again. Lee tries to, McClellan tries to, but McClellan's attention is really going to be focused now because of this destruction of one of his divisions on the northern end of the battlefield. And so McClellan will dispatch the Union 6th Corps to that area. When the 6th Corps arrives, William Franklin, the Corps commander, decides that he wants to attack. Edwin Sumner and he get into a pretty heated discussion by most accounts about whether or not to do this, Franklin wanting to attack, Sumner not wanting to. Eventually, McClellan himself is brought into this in person about 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 17th. When McClellan is riding towards the East Woods, where he meets with Sumner and Franklin, he is telling everybody, we're going to drive this attack forward, we're going to continue pushing this attack. But when he arrives in the East Woods, his mind is changed, partially because of what Edwin Sumner is telling him. And basically what Sumner tells him is, we can push Franklin forward, we can send him forward, sure, but if they meet with the same fate as what my men did earlier that morning, there is no federal force that is in shape, in a position to prevent the collapse of the federal right. And for McClellan, I think a man that is not one, he's a little risk averse, or at least he doesn't want to take a risk on that short of such a short snap decision. McClellan basically says, we're going to hold off the attack on the right flank because of that. And again, I think all that is from the fallout of Sumner being there, present in the West Woods, watching Sedgwick's division just get annihilated.
It was a little too bold for Little Mac.
Right, a little too bold, exactly. I like how you took on that really interesting aspect of the battle there, Kevin, because it's a complete switch for these guys' personalities. Sumner normally is seen as extremely aggressive. In fact, he was extremely aggressive that morning, but he's just gotten punched in the face with Sedgwick's division, and now he's reeling. Where Franklin, we normally think of him as being more cautious and not as driven. Of course, South Mountain and Crampton's Gap comes to mind, and yet he's the one now chomping at the bit to throw in his boys, the 6th Corps. And this actually is a good lead into the next one I had for you. Why is it that the West Woods, we talk about the fighting in the East Woods and the cornfield, especially in the West Woods, why is the West Woods so important there in the northern end of the field?
I think its importance really rests with the Confederate Army, who's able to hold on to it, and I think that's part of the reason that Sumner decides to move Sedgwick's division in that direction, is that the West Woods falls on the flank of any Union force that is moving from its position in the North Woods, roughly in that area, directly south, trying to seize the key piece of ground on that end of the battlefield, and that's the Dunker Church Plateau where the Visitor Center sits today. So for the Confederates to hold on to that, they can basically pester any Union force that's trying to advance due south to seize that high ground. Also for the Confederates, though, it's a place where their shattered commands could rest, reorganize, refit, and at least stage a good defensive action. You think about where the Confederate positions are on the morning of September 17th, at least east of the Hagerstown Pike, and how subjected those Confederates are to artillery fire, those heavy Union guns posted across Antietam Creek. If you're on the West Woods, those guns can't hit you because they can't see you. The West Woods is sort of on the opposite, the reverse slope of that prominent ridge line that the Hagerstown Pike runs on top of. Also, of course, it's a woodlot, so you can't see what's inside of it. And I think most importantly as well for Lee and Jackson and Stewart, and even Longstreet to some extent, if the Confederates hold on to the West Woods, they have a viewshed shield, if you will, that they can maneuver, stack troops up behind the West Woods, and the Federals will never see it coming. And so for the Confederates to hold on to that, it provides them so many different advantages. And, of course, you can then extrapolate and draw from that as to why it's so important for the Federals to hold on to that woodlot as well.
Absolutely. So why does Lee end up fighting with his back to the river? That was one we got from a couple different listeners. Why does Lee end up fighting once he's got his back to the river?
That's a very common question. And I think going back again to the barrier question, or the barrier point that I made, I think a lot of people come to the Antietam battlefield with the expectation that you'll come to Sharpsburg, you'll come to the Visitor Center, you'll walk out the front door of the Visitor Center, and the Potomac River is going to be right there, and you're going to get your feet wet in the river. I make it a point to tell people that on the entire tour, 3 hours, 4 hours, whatever it might be, you will never see the Potomac River. It's there, definitely. Yeah, it's there on a map if you look at it. We're not too far, but you'll never see it in person. And so I think the body of water that Lee is more focused on September 17th is not the Potomac River behind him, but it's the Antietam Creek in front of him. This is another trend, if you will, that Lee continually uses throughout the war, and that is using a body of water to divide his enemy. Remember, Lee is always the underdog, especially when it comes to the numbers of his army, and so Lee has to do, in his mind, whatever he can to try and equalize those numbers as best as possible. And the way to do that is to force the enemy to divide himself and come at him piecemeal. And Lee does this masterfully multiple times. But because Antietam Creek is not something that can be crossed anywhere. I think that's another misconception that people come to the battlefield with. Antietam Creek can only be crossed in certain points. And for McClellan to cross his army, it naturally has to be one corps at a time in most situations, because it's just going to take so long to get one corps across. If you think of the 1st Corps crossing at the Upper Bridge and the 12th Corps crossing at Prize Ford, and let's say the 5th Corps crossing at the Middle Bridge, it's going to take so long for that to happen. And so what McClellan does constantly when he crosses his corps across Antietam Creek is each corps never crosses. They don't all cross at one place. The 1st Corps uses 2 different crossing points. The 2nd Corps uses 2 different crossing points. The 9th Corps uses multiple crossing points as well. And that's to try and get as many men, establish as wide of a bridgehead as he possibly can. And again, I think Lee recognizes this. Lee knows this. He had the rare gift of seeing the Antietam battlefield the way George McClellan was going to see it. Lee approaches the battlefield the same way that George McClellan does. Lee just does it 2 days earlier. And so he knows what the strengths of his position are from an attacker's perspective, if you will, from what's going to be the Union perspective. And lastly, the thing I'll say about the Potomac River at his back is that Lee has a lot of space behind him to fall back on. Exactly. And I think, honestly, and Matt, you probably know this too, feel the same way. The position that Lee assumes, or the position that Lee's army is in on September 17th, is not the strongest position that he has, or that he could have taken. The strongest position that Lee takes is what his line looks like the morning of September 18th. The left flank is closer to the Potomac River. It's anchored on top of Rio Ridge, which is a more prominent ridge line than the Dunker Church Plateau is. Lee's line is much more consolidated at that point. And his flanks, which is an important point, both ends of his line are loosely anchored on the Potomac River. Also, if you've ever driven along Route 34 coming east, or going west, from, let's say, the area of the Middle Bridge, you'll rise up an ascent towards the National Cemetery. You'll drop back down into a bowl there in Sharpsburg, and then you'll notice as you're leaving Sharpsburg, you'll rise back up another rise. And so Lee has more places to fall back to. It's not as if he's driven into the Potomac River that all of a sudden, or if he's driven off the Sharpsburg Ridge line, that all of a sudden his men are going to be swimming in the Potomac River to get across. And another point I'll say, and it's easy for me to say, I know, but destruction of a Civil War army is just, it rarely happens. I mean, 10,000 engagements in the Civil War, you could probably count on one hand the number of times that an army is literally wiped off the map. And I think a great case in point of Franklin. There you go.
And yet they're still not destroyed there either.
That's very true. Yes, and even at Nashville.
Right.
But I think another good case in point is just look 3 days later, September 20th. Fitzjohn Porter crosses elements of 2 divisions of the 5th Corps across the Potomac River at Shepherdstown. That force gets, they are literally pinned with their back to the river, and not just their backs to the river, but they've also got their backs to a 100-foot cliff. And while those guys suffer some bloody noses, with the exception of one regiment, they make it out just fine. They make it out okay. And so fighting with your back to the river, while never a good thing, is not unheard of, and it's not thought to be a something that is really rolling all your dice, pushing all your chips into the center of the table, if you will.
So with that question, it sounds more like it's like we need to have a mentality shift as like a culture of people that are approaching this. It's not so much the river to Lee's back as it is the creek in front of him.
Correct. Yeah. And again, it sounds so stupid to say it, but I think Antietam Creek is the most underrated piece of terrain on the battlefield. And I think a lot of people, you look at the Park Service map and you look at all the green that consists of the battlefield, the 3,200 acres roughly that they own. 95+% of it is on the west side of the Antietam Creek. The exceptions are the Pry House, and the little bit of area down along the eastern side of Burnside Bridge. And so I think people view the creek as the eastern boundary of the battlefield, with just a couple of those exceptions. But in reality, we should be looking at the creek as not a boundary on the battlefield. It's in the middle of the battlefield, and it's something that the Federals have to get across in order to attack Lee.
Right. Well, you'd mentioned, Kevin, the positioning of Lee's army on the 18th, and that kind of rolls into the next kind of these big questions that we get a lot. Why doesn't, and here's your George McClellan question, why doesn't Little Mac, George McClellan, attack on the 18th?
I think that's
classic.
Clearly, as you can tell from me, I don't often give short answers, but I think this one is truly a long answer. So buckle up and be prepared for this. But I think there are multiple reasons, and McClellan spells them out pretty clearly in his report. And I think you have to take his report, or anybody's report, mostly at face value. I mean, those guys are there. We're not. Simple enough to say. But one of the things that McClellan looks at is, A, what has he gained on September 17th with all those attacks? And what McClellan sees is that, in parts, they've gained a few hundred yards, but nothing more than that. And every single attack that McClellan has thrown forward, the 1st Corps, the 12th Corps, the 2nd Corps, the 9th Corps, they've all initially met with success. But every single time they meet with success, what happens? They end up getting punched in the face and thrown back. And so what's McClellan to think that one more attack is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak. Another piece, and this ties back to the creek being in the middle of the battlefield as compared to the boundary of the battlefield, is you think about those roughly 40 guns of position, as McClellan calls them, on the east side of the Antietam. They can pretty much hit any part of Lee's line that they can see. And those guns are incredibly important, in my opinion, to McClellan's mindset. One of the first things that McClellan does when he arrives on the Antietam battlefield on September 15th is orders his Chief of Artillery, Henry Hunt, to get those guns into position. By September 17th, yep, yeah, exactly right. By September 17th, the end of the 17th, those guns are out of ammunition. They can no longer support any Federal attacks on the west side of the Antietam Creek. And there is a train that's hurried up from Washington, really an incredible feat of engineering and technology, a train that's hurried up from Washington carrying 38 tons of ammunition for those guns on the east side of the Antietam. But that train has to go from, there's no direct rail connection to Sharpsburg. The iron bridge carrying the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad across the Monocacy River has been destroyed by the Confederates, and so the quickest way to get that ammunition to McClellan's army is to send the trains from Washington, D.C. through Baltimore all the way into Pennsylvania, west towards Shippensburg, Chambersburg, and basically just a big arc down to Hagerstown. Hagerstown is the closest rail connection at that point. That ammunition arrives in Hagerstown, I believe the exact time is 1:20 in the afternoon, and yes, I have no life for remembering that. But when that ammunition is then arrived in Hagerstown, you think, well, it's there, right? But no, in fact, it's not. It still has to be offloaded off the trains, put into wagons. The wagons have to be driven from Hagerstown to Sharpsburg. They drive 2-3 miles an hour. Yep, and by the time the ammunition gets there, it's already dark. And so McClellan doesn't have that supporting arm of the artillery, of his artillery, if you will. Lastly, I think thinking about the bigger picture, and I don't like to think of this as a defense, so to speak, of anybody, but this is just what McClellan truly believed and what he truly felt. And he writes so in his reports and his letters to his wife. But when McClellan leaves Washington, what are his objectives? And I think his objectives are very limited. And I think they come straight from Lincoln and Henry Halleck. Lincoln will, of course, say September 15th, after he receives glowing reports about what McClellan has done to the Confederate army at South Mountain, Lincoln will write very famously, "Destroy the rebel army if possible." Of course, if possible is maybe it can be done, maybe it can't. But before that, McClellan's campaign objectives are, I think, pretty clearly spelled out to him. And the main one is simply get Lee out of Maryland, get him back into Virginia. And I think that McClellan, who certainly believes highly in himself, I think he partially believes. I think, if McClellan shocks Lee by moving quicker than Lee anticipates to Frederick, I think then Lee does the exact opposite and shocks McClellan several times during the actions around Antietam. I would say that McClellan never expects Lee to be there with his army on the morning of September 16th, but Lee is there. I think after McClellan believes that he has battered Lee's army on the 17th, I think he's kind of almost hopeful because of the state of his army, which he believes is pretty bad, that Lee is not going to be there on the 18th. And of course, when Lee is, I think McClellan is a little surprised. McClellan is one that doesn't do well with surprises. I think he's somebody as an engineer that really has to have everything in order and well thought out and well planned out before he's going to move and attack. And when Lee is still there on the 18th, I think it does kind of shock McClellan a little bit. And he ultimately believes that he has achieved his job of at least containing Lee and giving Lee no other option but to go back across the Potomac River into Virginia. And one of the more telling things, I think, a lot of people will debate, because McClellan's objectives for the campaign are never written out by Lincoln or anybody. But if you look at what Lincoln is reported to have said on September 22nd, when he shows his cabinet and tells his cabinet that he is going to announce the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's words are, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but basically he says that when intelligence was received that the rebel army was at Frederick, Lincoln made a promise to himself and to God that if or when the rebels would be driven out of Maryland, that he would follow them with a proclamation of emancipation. And that's straight from the horse's mouth 5 days after Antietam. Lincoln doesn't say he made a promise to himself that when McClellan destroyed the rebel army, he says when Lee is driven out of Maryland. That's his bar for victory that he sets.
Pretty clear cut from the boss man himself.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to make sense.
As I was listening to that, I was humored by this trend in Civil War orders and language, the vagueness, the open to interpretation, the if possible. Yes, please. You
Hold on 1 second.
Yeah. Kevin just asked us if we would like him to turn his lights on. It's getting
there
a
we
wee
go.
bit dark.
It got dark a lot faster than I thought it would.
Yeah, I had the same problem. I had to turn on another lamp.
We're in the mid-Atlantic transition time. It's like dark, suddenly dark.
Yeah, it came real fast.
But what I was saying was I was kind of getting a chuckle out of the theme of things left open to interpretation, like do this if possible, take this hill if practicable. Just say what you mean. Like, what do you want me to do? These are called orders, not suggestions. Right. Cool. So, Kevin, I'm getting down to my last two questions here. One is our last question from me, from a listener, and then I got one for you myself. All right. So we'll close with that one. So my last question from a listener comes from all the way out in Salt Lake City, Utah. It comes from Chris, who asks, what is one thing you would like or hope everyone who visits Antietam Battlefield to take away or understand about what happened there? Sort of a personal question. Like, what's one thing that you, like, whenever you give a tour, I guess, what's one point you always hope you convey or get across, or you hope people take away?
Well, I'll state the obvious first, because I think every person that comes to Antietam needs to come away with the fact that this battle, the bloodiest single day in American military history, leads to the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a changing document, not just during the Civil War, not just in the summer of 1862, but in American history. And I think that's obviously the biggest takeaway that everybody should come away from Antietam remembering, and at least having that, that fact in their back pocket, if you will. What I would say, to extend beyond that, because I hope that that's the one thing at least everybody really comes away from. But if people were to really spend some time at Antietam, hopefully if you're there for 10 minutes, hopefully you at least hear about that it's the bloodiest day in American history and the Emancipation Proclamation. Hopefully you at least get that. But if you are there for a little bit longer, I think it's so important to be able to just get out onto the ground and see it. You don't have to walk far to realize how unique Antietam's terrain is and how difficult it is and how much it dictates the battle. And you don't even have to be there that long to realize that. But find me a part of the battlefield that's as flat as a pancake, and you're not going to struggle to get up a hill or with ease go downhill. The battlefield is up and down. There's all these different ravines, hills, ditches. Some of it's very subtle, some of it's very obvious, but I think the terrain just plays such a role in how that battle is fought and why it is only a very minor Union victory, but also why it's the bloodiest single day in American history. And one of my running jokes, but I think it's actually true, is of all the signs on the battlefield, you got over 300 plus iron tablets written by Ezra Carman and the Antietam Battlefield Board, all the excellent signage that the National Park Service has done. One of my favorite signs on the battlefield, actually my favorite, is on Stark Avenue, west of the Hagerstown Pike. And if you're coming off Route 65 and you turn onto Stark Avenue, there's a giant hill in front of you, and there's a sign, a Maryland Department of Transportation sign, and it says "Hill blocks view." It's like, well, yeah, no, duh. But I think that says so much about the Antietam battlefield, and for guys, generals that are trying to make these decisions, or even colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors, captains even, trying to make these decisions. If that hill blocks your view, well, then you literally have no idea what's on the other side of that hill.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, I love the terrain, sort of the having lived in the area for so long, the coming to understand how the terrain plays one of the central roles in the battle. The first time somebody put it to me, it was a ranger at the park, walk 100 yards in any direction and tell me your view is the same. Like, that was super eye-opening. And just the concept of, like, that little kid question that everybody asks, what if they had machine guns? Somebody said, what if they had one set of walkie-talkies?
Right.
Just with a terrain like that, you think about how invaluable the ability to communicate over a long distance would have been. Or like, we're First World War guys, so to think about, like, the Parrott guns on the other side of Antietam Creek with the fighting in the West Woods they couldn't see. What if there was just the ability to communicate, like, overshoot, you could hit that? Like, the terrain is just, it's spectacularly devastating for both those armies over there.
Talking about the terrain actually kind of moves into my last question pretty well, because it comes back down to the man level, the individual soldier. We've been doing a lot of the big concepts of the Maryland campaign. A lot of great questions came in, not only from our listeners, but also just some of those classic questions that we get from the visitors to the battlefield itself. But this one is a bit more technical and comes down to the man level itself. There was a letter that Pat had read during our discussion last time, Kevin, from a soldier in the 130th Pennsylvania Infantry. And he talks about just putting out lead, 80 some, nearly 90 rounds throughout his time in front of the bloody lane there. And he comments about having to pick up other muskets to do this. Now, can you explain to our listeners why that is? Why couldn't he use his rifle throughout the whole day? What's causing him to have to pick up something else?
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, and you guys definitely feel free to jump in on this as well. It's you're a lot more into the living history than I am, at least recently. But really, what it comes down to, I mean, the propellant, if you will, that's sending the bullets downrange, black powder, is an incredibly, I know you two have dealt with it before, but if nobody ever has, I mean, it gets everywhere,
right?
And you don't even know how. You eat black powder when you when you bite into a cartridge.
Newsflash, black powder is dirty.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yes, there you go. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. Black powder is very, very dirty, and when you cake that with an explosion inside the confined barrel of a gun, trying to force a bullet that is barely small enough to fit within that barrel. I mean, there's not much space at all between the edge of the barrel and the edge of that bullet to try and fit that into that gun. It eventually becomes impossible. It really does, and I've seen accounts from other battles of soldiers having to take. They put the bullet into the gun that's pretty fouled up, dirtied at this point. They put their ramrod in, and they've got to jam this thing up against a tree or a rock,
Right.
or
Exactly.
anything like that. And
you hit the term right there too, Kevin. Fouling. That's what's happening.
Yeah. Right. Yep,
the gun has
exactly.
become foul.
And if your life and death in many cases on a Civil War battlefield depends on you being able to load and fire faster than the guy standing opposite you, you're going to look for whatever gun will allow you to do that. And if it means picking up a gun from a wounded soldier or a dead soldier off the field that's cleaner, then you're going to do that. And it comes to a point where your gun is just no longer functional because of all the fouling there.
Yeah, right. Plus the barrels get really hot. And I don't know about you, but like cranking off just a few rounds, your barrel gets really hot. Cranking off 10, 20, 30, however many you're realistically getting out of that rifle before it's fouled and gunked up to the point where you got to get a new one. Like, guys, remember, this is a September day in the Mid-Atlantic. Like, we touched on this in the episode. This is a disservice done to every Antietam pop culture moment in TV and film, is they always make this like it's a winter scene. You can see breath and there's like an implied coldness going on. Like, it's a hot day. I mean, it's in the high 70s, low 80s. It's humid, right? And these guys are also like rapid firing their muskets. So the barrels are hot just from the exposure to the sun. And now we're like cranking fire through these tubes on these endless rates. So, good luck if you have a gun that's even clean enough to fire. You don't even want to hold it. So you might just be grabbing a new one because one's been laying on the ground for long enough, and you're like, Jesus, my fingers are burning.
Yeah, that's absolutely true too. I didn't even think about that, but you're absolutely right. My days of reenacting, I can remember firing, like you said, 10 rounds, and it's already so damn hot you want to just drop the gun.
That's right. That leads to one of the worst reenactorisms that I see out on the field are the people walking around with the barrel,
the leather wraps.
The leather barrel
I was just talking about those today with one of my coworkers. Yep. Oh yeah. Looks like they're should be out fighting Native Americans out west.
I don't know. I'll say it like this: convenient, not correct.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. It's a good way to put it.
Leave that one right there. All right, so Kevin, if you'll indulge me for a minute, my last question, or the last question for you, comes from a Pat McGuire in Frederick, Maryland, co-host of the History Things podcast.
I don't know if I'll take this one.
Yeah,
you better watch this one. It might be a little dodgy.
Yeah, his question could be a little racy here. This is something that I've talked about with Matt at length about before, and it's something that I think you'll appreciate, and I think our listeners might not get into the minutia of the whole campaign to really sort of understand this. So my question to you is, what effect does the death of Jesse Reno have on the campaign? Because I have a great what if for you after you sort of get into this for a minute, because I have a what if about how the battle might have fared. The Antietam battle might have fared if Reno had been there. So what are your thoughts on the effect of the death of General Reno?
Okay. Firstly, I'll say I think Jesse Reno is a pretty competent Corps commander in his short stint as a commander in the Ninth Corps, but it is his death that it's not the undoing of the Ninth Corps, but it really hampers the Ninth Corps. And I know I just said that I think Reno's a very capable Corps commander, but I don't think it's so much his personal death, his loss, that so much hampers the Ninth Corps, but it's a lot of the fallout from that. So, right, it's like dropping a pebble in a lake. And, it's cliche. You see all those ripples. It's the ripple effect of what's going to happen. So the first thing that's going to happen is, of course, Reno is dead, and in the midst of a moving, fluid situation and campaign, all of a sudden somebody who is probably never had Corps command of the Ninth Corps or of any corps is going to be thrust into that position. And in this case, it ends up being Jacob Dolson Cox, who is an Ohio politician. He's not a professional soldier, though he does turn out to be a capable soldier, I think. Yeah, he's not great, but certainly not bad. I think he's steady-go-lucky type of a commander. But when Reno dies and his body is brought back east from South Mountain, his staff, so the Corps staff, accompany him, meaning that the guys that really are running all the gears of this Corps. Yeah, exactly. These guys that know all the ins and outs of the Ninth Corps are now gone. They've left the scene. So that brings us now to the Ninth Corps arriving on the Antietam Creek. And again, you think of now Cox is elevated to command of the Ninth Corps, but you think he goes from division to corps, so now somebody in his division is going to have to go brigade to division, and somebody in that brigade is going to go regiment to brigade. So it just creates all these ripple effects of guys that are now being promoted very, very quickly in, a very fluid situation all of a sudden. You think of, maybe you might get lucky by having somebody promoted up a level that fits them, but maybe somebody else might not. And so it's just going to, you're only as strong as your weakest link. As the expression goes. And so sometimes that could happen. But also with the Ninth Corps, going back earlier into the campaign, it's a very common misconception, I think, that people come to the battlefield and believe that the Ninth Corps is all Ambrose Burnside. It's Burnside's guys. It's Burnside's sector of the battlefield. It's Burnside's bridge, right? He's the guy that has the bridge named after him. So it's a lot more complicated than that. And I wouldn't say that it's a wrong conception that people have, but it's much more complicated. So earlier in the campaign, when McClellan is moving the Army of the Potomac out from Washington, he will basically create several wings for his army. And the right wing is going to consist of the First Corps under Joseph Hooker, the Ninth Corps under Jesse Reno, and Ambrose Burnside is in command of that wing. When you think about those two corps on September 14th at the Battle of South Mountain, they're divided by about a mile. The First Corps is fighting north of Turner's Gap around Frosttown. The Ninth Corps is, of course, fighting south of Turner's Gap at Fox's Gap. The next morning, September 15th, when McClellan receives word that his enemy has fled the South Mountain battlefield, McClellan pushes his army in pursuit. And in order to expedite the process, rather than getting these wings back together, he just decides to temporarily suspend the wing structure of his army. And he will send the First Corps straight down to Boonesboro, and the Ninth Corps is going to its first orders are to go into Pleasant Valley and link up with Franklin and the Sixth Corps, and then, if not, to push straight west towards Sharpsburg from Fox's Gap. Then getting even further, you look at the Battle of Antietam. The First Corps is way up in the northern end of the battlefield. The Ninth Corps is way in the southern end of the battlefield. So that wing command is completely nixed. It's gone. However, Ambrose Burnside was under the impression, and probably not wrongly, that McClellan's suspension of wing command was only temporary. However, Burnside thought it was going to be a lot more temporary than McClellan did, apparently. And so Burnside clung to the opinion that he was still in command of a wing on September 17th. And so that meant that nominally Jacob Cox was in command of the Union Ninth Corps. Now, getting back to the staff and Jesse Reno's staff leaving, Cox will plead with Burnside personally to take command of the Ninth Corps. Burnside turns it down. But one of the reasons that Cox is asking for Burnside to take command of the Corps is that Cox says he doesn't have enough staff officers to operate an entire Corps. He only has enough staff officers to operate his division. So Burnside says that he will loan some of his staff officers to Cox. But really what you get is that the Ninth Corps, which has already become, or at least is sort of viewed as the redheaded stepchild of the Army of the Potomac, because each of its four divisions have never fought together in a corps formation before. Each of the four division commanders on September 17th in the Ninth Corps have never commanded at that level before on a battlefield. Its corps commander, Jacob Cox, has never commanded at that level before on a battlefield. And to make it even worse, any orders coming from McClellan, who believes that Burnside is in command of the Ninth Corps, goes from McClellan to Burnside. Burnside, who believes that Cox is in command of the Ninth Corps, then passes those orders to Jacob Cox. And so Burnside is really serving. I've never come up with a good word for it, but really the only thing that comes to mind is he's almost like a supernumerary. Just he's a title, and that's all he holds. He doesn't have any duties, or he doesn't have a job description, so to speak. And so what it creates is this Ninth Corps that's trying to meld itself together on the march and on the battlefield. And if it does not have stable leadership at the top, which it doesn't because of this funky command situation, then it's just going to be, it's not going to be running up to snuff, so to speak. It's not going to be as efficient as it possibly could be. And that's all those ripples of Jesse Reno being killed on September 14th at South Mountain.
I love that. Thank you. That was such a great answer. And I feel like that's just something people don't get into a lot or enough when they approach the campaign as a whole. Because I like to think things, not always in a what if, like, and I hate that I always use this analogy because people are always like, what if Jackson was at Gettysburg? Ugh. But like, we were just talking about, the Ninth Corps is in this, like, trying to figure out what the heck is going on while they're on march, while a battle is happening around them. They're all trying to figure out not only, like, what the show is, but who's running it. And, what the effects would have been on the battle had all the institutions and officers and everything remained in place. And Jesse Reno, who was kind of a self-starter style commander, one of my what ifs was like, would he have recognized the need to just power across the bridge, earlier in the day? And then one of my big what ifs with Matt we were talking about is like, what if the bridge is carried before noon? That's a little bit of a different rabbit hole than the follow-up question thing, but it just sort of that thought came out of the effect of Reno, because like, one of my fun thoughts was if Reno had, not bought the farm at South Mountain and he was there in command, and they do sort of independently get across the bridge and take that away. One of the things we were talking about is I think the whole focus of the battle shifts immediately down there. All these other fights, West Woods, everything become what ifs. They become if they even happen, because the bridge is that tactically important. And, Reno has even major effects in the what if realm kind of thing. So I wanted to ask about him personally because, I feel like he gets kind of swept under the history table and we just kind of forget about him a lot.
Yeah, very much so. I think he's definitely an underrated what if that a lot of people that come to the battlefield never even consider Jesse Reno's death and the effect that has on the Army of the Potomac.
And in terms of modern day, like, remembrances, living locally to where, he is killed on the field and things like that, I always crack up because he's got a wayside marker instructing you about his actual monument. Like, you can drive down the road and see one of those classic gray historical markers that you think is like, here on this spot, something went down, and you get there and you read it and it's like 2 miles to the left of here. 2 miles to the left of here is where this guy got killed, and there's a marker there. And it's like, oh, cool, thanks. Like, it's like super awkward, like, because it grabs you, makes you want to pull over and see it, and then it's just directing you.
Then you realize, you got to drive 2 miles off the main highway, and a lot of people probably don't take that trip.
Yeah, they're like, no thanks, Reno. But like, and that's the other thing is like, for a guy that gets swept under the table, like almost anything in our country named Reno is named after this guy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep.
Like
yeah, Reno, Nevada.
No exception to that.
Yeah, that's very true, and he is definitely, I think, an underappreciated commander in the Civil War, and somebody that a lot of people don't really think about or pay attention to. Besides the fun fact of where was he killed? That's probably what a lot of people know about Jesse Reno, is that he's killed at South Mountain, but they don't think of the effects of that.
So, well, I appreciate you indulging me on that one for a minute here.
Yeah, it sounds like I earned my way back on the show, so that's good.
Yeah, man. We had a great time. We had a great time with you in the big Maryland campaign episode. And honestly, that episode could have been like 6 hours long between you two and the questions I wanted to ask. Like, I can't wait to get you back on the show and do this again. Before we get out of here,
back on. Yeah, I can't wait to be back on. Thanks for giving me the chance to talk about this.
Absolutely, man. It's our pleasure. Before we get out of here, any final thoughts from you here, Matt?
No, just I think we had a wide breadth of questions, not only some of the common kind of idea questions that we get at the battlefield, but also some great questions from our listeners. I appreciate everybody for throwing those in who did. Remember, we're going to be doing this sort of format with each of our discussions with a follow-up with the presenter. That way you can engage with them. And Kevin, I greatly appreciate with the crazy schedules and all the cancellations we had to do, your willingness to do this kind of impromptu Skype
no problem. I mean, pandemic or not, I've got nothing better to do with my life than talk history, so I'm all in.
You'd rather not. Yeah. What else would you rather do?
That's right. Exactly.
Excellent. So Kevin, before you get out of here, what's going on with your stuff coming up? With the quarantines and everything. I know you're still working. Are there any online programs, anything that we can direct our listeners to?
Yeah.
This is also being a video. Anything we can direct them to watch that you're working on?
Well, in a professional capacity, I work for Prince William County Historic Preservation Division, so we are really ramping up our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, because we can't reach our visitors in the normal way of doing so, face to face. But now it's all through social media, so we're posting several things every single day on Facebook. Go ahead and follow us. The Antietam Battlefield Guides Facebook page as well. We're staying pretty active and staying busy trying to post questions every week for folks to answer and different factoids about this Antietam personality was born on this day, stuff like that. So I don't really have a personal page, I guess, where I do that, but just kind of running it through a couple of other different organizations. And then on my blog page, I guess I do a little bit of that as well, trying to ramp up some of my research and writing on that blog. So
cool. Where can they find your blog, Kevin?
It's just antietambrigades.blogspot.com, and then I've also got a Facebook page for it as well. So just where I post a lot of my deep thoughts and research about the Maryland campaign.
Cool. Since this podcast will also be a video, what we'll do is we will get Kevin to send us all the official links and things like that so we can type them out and put them on the screen so you guys can make sure you're following along with everything that he's doing down in Prince William County and on his Antietam Brigade stuff. So I guess we'll get out of here with a couple things coming up. What's going on in the History Things podcast world, I guess you could say. We just had episode 2 released with all of our good friend Avery Lentz. So we continued our 1862 timeline, which you were awesome at helping us set up and working through the spring, summer, and fall. We have our state of the podcast address. Our mid-year address is going to come up in a couple months. Matt and I are vigorously working through the pre-production phases of episode 3 of the podcast with our guest Parker Russell. We have kind of restructured what that episode is going to be a couple different ways, and so episode 3 officially will be a history of the White Star Line. We had talked about the idea of doing the whole golden era of transatlantic ocean travel, but there's so much to that topic that, again, we're trying to keep it within a certain time length. Like, episode 2 is an almost 4-hour monster.
Oh my gosh.
To try to keep it like between 2 to 4 hours, we decided to break the transatlantic stuff down into several periods. So we're going to start with the White Star Line. So, it's the most recognizable. We've got, obviously, the RMS Titanic wreck, which we're going to obviously focus a good bit on. But
a lot of time with that. Yep.
Yeah, right. So that's coming up here. And, with all the crazy stuff going on, I guess we're just all kind of focusing on keeping our heads on straight about us. Being in quarantine can kind of, wreck your brain a bit. So we'll get out of here with some just some positive encouragement, and we'll start with a big thanks. Thank you to everybody who has actually helped make this podcast be as successful as it has been right out of the gate. It has just been very overwhelmingly cool to see how much love we're getting for it. So thank you. This was nerve-wracking and fun experience to get off the ground, and you guys are making us feel really good about it. So thank you for that. And to try to, return the favor, hopefully the content that we're producing is helping keep your mind off some of the weirdness in the world right now. But, just as a reminder to everybody out there, like, keep your heads on. You can
keep
reach
your heads
out
up,
to the
too.
Yeah, keep your heads up. And you can reach out to the podcast here, even if you just need to say, hey, for something. We know that this is a historic time we're living in, and we're all in it together. So, aside from the basics, like obviously stay at home and social distancing, if you have to go out, that stuff does matter. As a cool reference, if you really want some cool historical context, our buddy Jake Wynn over at Jake's got a lot of brands he's associated with. His personal brand, Winning History, Pennsylvania in the Civil War Medicine here in Frederick, Claire Bart, Missing Soldiers in D.C. On his personal blog, one more brand. He's got the Pennsylvania Coal History page, which is great. But Jake started keeping a sort of modern times compared to the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic thing. So there's a lot of really cool historical context and parallels. So follow him over on Winning History for that stuff. If you need how does this relate to modern times kind of history lessons. But we love you guys. Thank you so much for supporting us. Kevin, thanks for stopping by and hanging out with us again. We'll get you back soon. For everybody here at the History Things podcast, I'm Pat. That's Matt.
And I'm Matt.
Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you all later.